absorption, but then we see flexion at the waist. Normally we would want to see the person striking with more of a leaning forward posture, being able to draw a straight line from the shoulder to the hip, and then ultimately to the ankle. Other things that we can note, as he comes through mid-support, he does start to lean forward, which is a good thing as he's getting ready for propulsion. In the propulsive phase here, we can see a better lineup for propulsion. In other words, a straighter line from his ankle to his knee, to his hip, to his shoulder as he's starting to move forward. Let's watch the right lower extremity now. As he comes down, we can see that he is a forefoot striker in this area, and that's going to accentuate any sort of abnormality he has in his foot, if his foot is turned to the inside or inverted, or if it's turned to the outside or everted. In his particular case, since we can see a little bit of the bottom of his shoe, we know that his foot is inverted, and we're probably dealing with some sort of a inverted deformity like a rear foot or forefoot varus. As he comes from strike and forward, we can see right at the moment of strike, his knee is flexed, but again he's flexed forward at the waist. Head is in a good position here, but this is not a very biomechanically efficient position as he strikes the ground. So we're coming forward. Now what he has to do is decelerate all of his body weight before he has a tendency to re-accelerate it again. As we come forward again, we start to see a much better propulsion phase here with the ankle, knee, hip, and shoulder starting to line up. You can watch the left extremity again, and this particular slide right here really demonstrates the inversion or twisting inward of his foot. In other words, the underside of his foot is facing the opposite foot, as well as the external spin, or what we call external torsion, or increased progression angle, where this ankle is touching the ground. And we can see this lateral progression here. So then, rather than progressing during his propulsion phase, or his toe off of the great toe in this area, in order to do that by twisting this foot outward, that causes a lot of mechanical inefficiency through the lower extremity here and through the waist. And this particular area here accentuates that inversion as well. From this position, slightly being behind him, we can really see the consequences of the flexion at the waist as he's going forward. So to review, coming back just a little bit here, as we hit the ground during foot stance, we're looking for some pronation to occur at the ankle here. In other words, some shock absorption needs to occur, and that will occur as a result of some pronation at the foot, dorsiflexion at the ankle, flexion at the knee, flexion at the hip. And we're seeing that, however, this particular individual is relatively inefficient. During the mid-support phase, so we're going from strike right here into mid-support, and then ultimately toe off in this particular frame, this foot needs to be fully supinating. In other words, it needs to turn itself into a rigid lever so that he can propel himself forward. And then finally, during the toe off phase, pushing off, we want to see a straight line from the ankle, the knee, the hip, and here. So if we had more torso flexion occurring here and him being in a more linear position, we would probably see more mechanical efficiency. Let's look at our same runner from the posterior view. This will give us more insight during the contact phase when his foot's touching the ground, as well as his recovery phase when his foot is in the air, as far as biomechanical abnormalities and compensations that may be occurring. The first thing I'd like to point out as he comes up and strikes on his right foot is noting that the right foot is striking in inversion. In other words, it's turned under and the inside of his foot is facing towards the left side of the screen. You'll also notice that his right lower extremity is turned out, or he has an increased progression angle on this side, And lastly, we notice that he tends to strike more on his forefoot. Let's watch the left foot as he comes forward. As the left foot hits the ground, we can see that again it strikes in inversion. This may be a consequence of an abnormality of his rear foot, where his calcaneus is turned in, called rear foot varus, where his forefoot is turned in, called forefoot varus, and also due to this curvature that we see in his tibia, called tibial varum. In the next sequence here, as the right foot hits the ground, you can really see that the foot tends to be twisted out somewhat, and he tends to strike on the forefoot. Watch the left extremity in this sequence here. Here we can really see that inversion occurring here. He has his weight on the outside of the foot. This has biomechanical consequences, as we'll see right here. Because the weight is on the outside of his foot, he has to shift his weight in order to move his center of gravity, otherwise he'll fall to the outside. So he shifts his pelvis to the right side. Because now the pelvis weighs much more than his foot, as he shifts to the right, his center of gravity falls to the right, so now he needs to move it back to midline, and he does so by arcing his torso to the left side and dropping this left shoulder here. Let's watch the next sequence. Watch the foot going from inversion here to a relatively flat position right here. Watch the change in the pelvis from here to here. Watch the change in the shoulder from here to here. Now, as he starts to push off, we can see that he shifts from the middle of his foot back to the outside of his foot, because that's where his strengths lie. He is utilizing what we call a low gear push-off. Remember, high gear push-off was an attempt to push off the large toe. Low gear is an attempt to push off the lesser metatarsals. This is costing him efficiency here as well as here, and he needs to move his upper body in compensation. Let's watch his right extremity here. We can really see that that foot is turned out to the outside. In other words, it's abducted away from his body, and he has a tendency to strike into a lot of inversion on this side. Not as much as on the left side, but we're striking on the outside with the foot turned out. This is a toe strike. Watch the consequence of this heel falling here. Watch what's happening at the pelvis here. Watch what's happening at the shoulder here. As we come forward and watch his left foot, this again exemplifies the issue. Inversion here, weight on the outside of the foot, a pelvic shift that you can really see between these two sequences, and that shift being compensated for by a drop shoulder and movement laterally on that side. Notice the amount of upper body compensation occurring during his recovery or swing phase. He needs to move his arms pretty much across his body on both sides, and you'll notice that he brings his right arm more across his body and his left arm more in front of his body. So this runner exemplifies some abnormalities during the contact phase, that being the foot stance, mid-support, and toe-off phase that we're seeing here, as well as some follow-through abnormalities or recovery phase, swing phase abnormalities that we're seeing here, from follow-through to forward swing to foot descent.